Welcome to the lab. This is the Bake Scientist channel where we explore the why so you know how. Today, we are exploring the why behind fudgy, chocolatey, rich and chewy brownies. So stay tuned, make sure to subscribe, and hit that notification bell to stay up to date on all the delicious science. Now let's get into it. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to measure our cocoa powder. And cocoa powder tends to be clumpy because it's such a fine powder, it tends to clump together. So what I like to do is I like to sift my cocoa powder into my measuring, whatever I'm measuring, using to measure with, so that it can already be nice and sifted and we're not getting any clumps in our finished product. But let's go ahead and talk a little bit about cocoa powder and what actually it is. So cocoa powder is it's the byproduct of cocoa butter making. So when cocoa butter is made, there's cocoa solids that are left behind from after the butter has been extracted from the cacao beans, and that cocoa solid is what it makes up cocoa powder. And cocoa powder is made up of mainly two different solids. They are theobromine, which is the flavor, the chocolate flavor. It contributes a lot to the chocolate flavor. And then there's phenethylamine, which it gives you kind of the good feeling when you eat chocolate. It's more of the feeling compound. So those are the main two compounds in the solids that you find in the cocoa powder. And cocoa powder can actually come in two different kinds. There's natural cocoa powder, which I'm actually using here, and then there's Dutch pressed cocoa powder. By nature, cocoa powder tends to be more acidic. It tends to be around a pH of 5, which is why cocoa powder is bitter. Dutch pressed cocoa powder has been alkalinized, which means it's been made more basic. It's been made more basic so that it has more of a neutral pH. So the pH for Dutch press is around 7. And what this does is it makes the color of the cocoa powder a little bit darker, and it also gives the cocoa powder a milder taste. So not as bitter, but still bitter. So cocoa powder, since it's naturally bitter, we do tend to add a lot of sugar to our cocoa powder. And as I mentioned, this is a solid, so this is a solid compound. And in order to help intensify the chocolate flavor a little bit more, I'm going to do something which is called blooming the cocoa powder. And to bloom cocoa powder, you add your cocoa powder, or a portion, as I did here, a portion of your cocoa powder to the liquid in your recipe. And for brownies, our liquid is coming mainly from our fat. So I'm putting in the oil here, and then the hot, just freshly melted butter straight in. You want to use hot liquid to help bloom your your cocoa powder. Sorry. So what you want to do is you just pretty much pour the hot liquid, and this liquid can be milk, it can be water, it can be butter, any kind of oil, well, whatever oil you're using for your recipe. It can be coffee even. Some coffee is a good enhancer of flavor for chocolate, so that's a good thing to add as well. But here I'm using, like I said, warm butter, melted butter. So what you want to do is you just want to stir your cocoa powder into whatever the hot liquid is, and just make sure it's all dissolved. And as it sits, so you want to let this, once you get all the cocoa powder incorporated, you want to let it sit for a few minutes. And as it sits, it'll thicken the liquid just a little bit, and it'll also impart its flavor, so a very rich chocolate flavor into the liquid. So now you kind of are injecting your baked good with more chocolate flavor than just adding the cocoa powder. The cocoa powder alone will give you a chocolate flavor, but this will really deepen and make it more rich. And I only did a portion of my cocoa powder here because I didn't have enough oil in my recipe to do the whole amount. But depending on the ratio of your liquid to cocoa powder ratio in your recipe, you can bloom all of your cocoa powder and you'll get a really, really rich flavor. But you just want to make sure you're conscious of how much liquid you have compared to how much cocoa powder you have, because you can't, it has to be a liquid. You can't bloom it if it's going to be a paste. So you really want to make sure the liquid is enough so that you can actually bloom your cocoa powder. So now I'm going to go ahead and add my remaining dry ingredients to the cocoa powder that I already sifted. And here I have my flour, salt, and cornstarch in this here. And so there's very little flour in this recipe, if you notice. And this is because for brownies, we want a batter. We want the brownie to come out a little bit fudgy and chewy. In order to do that, we need to have less gluten development, so that means less flour. And even though there's less flour, it's not going to be liquid because the cocoa powder does absorb a good amount of liquid, so it will act in the sense like flour, where it will provide a little bit of structure, but it's not going to give us any gluten development because it doesn't have those same kind of gluten proteins that flour has. And as you saw, I've sifted the flour through, and some of the kosher salt stayed behind, so I just dumped it in. So that's we're just going to sift that in, and then we're going to mix it with our whisk just to make sure we are avoiding any clumps. And then we're going to set it aside and get the rest of our ingredients ready. So no baked good is ever finished without a little bit of egg science. So here we have 4 whole eggs, and we're using whole eggs for our brownie recipe. And what we're going to do is we are actually going to whip our eggs to incorporate some air. And if you've seen our scrambled egg video, you'll know some of the science behind eggs. And eggs are full of proteins that create a nice mesh web when baked or cooked. They create a web that you can kind of utilize it in a lot of different applications. And here we're actually going to whip some air into the egg so we can expand the protein, the mesh webs that the protein creates, and we're going to give a little bit air to that so that when we add our sugar can get encapsulated in the air pockets. And what we're trying to do is we're kind of creating a fake meringue, because meringue is just egg whites whipped, but here we have the whole egg whipping. So we are going to get a little bit of foam, but it's not gonna hold a structure like a meringue would, because it's not just the egg white. But we are going to be able to get enough of a foam where we're going to be able to get a lift out of the end product because of the whipped egg. And that rise is going to bring the sugars with it, because we're going to go ahead and whip the sugars into our aerated eggs in a minute. And the sugars will, again, like I said, they'll actually incorporate into the water in the egg white. So they'll be able to melt into the water, and they'll be taken with that egg white as it whips in the air pockets, and it'll be able to create a nice wet mesh structure filled with air and sugar. And our goal is to create a nice crust on top of our brownie. And I know you've seen brownies that have a nice like crinkly crust on top. That's our goal. And one good easy way to get that is to whip up your eggs with your sugar. And that, like I said, will help when it bakes, you'll get the separation of the the crust layer, due to the egg setting. And so if you ever made a meringue, you know that how it creates the foamy kind of texture when it bakes. That's because you've whipped air into those mesh pockets that the egg naturally creates when it's baked. The mesh web that it creates. And since we've whipped air into it, we've expanded that web and made it larger, made the air pockets larger. And these larger air pockets, when baked, the protein structures will solidify and get hard, and they hold that structure with the air pockets in it. And so since we're also adding sugar, that sugar will crystallize and also create a nice caramely crunchy top. So we're getting the nice crust from the lift with the egg and the sugar. So that's where we're getting our crust from. So this step is pretty important to getting that crusty top on your brownie. And as you can see, I just added my white sugar, and we're going to let that mix and incorporate, and then we're going to go ahead and add our brown sugar. So you definitely want to make sure you're whipping your eggs first to get them nice and frothy, and then you're adding your sugars and whipping it again before you add any other ingredients. You want to make sure your sugars are nicely incorporated into the egg so that they can give you that crust that you really want at the end. While the sugar is incorporating into our eggs, I'm going to go ahead and take a moment just to say, if you enjoy learning the science behind your favorite baked goods and understanding what's going on so you can adjust and create and explore in your own kitchen, please subscribe and hit that notification bell to stay up to date on all the science. We're always coming out with new videos, and we love to share the science with you guys. So if you love this kind of content and you love learning not only how to bake, but also the science behind it, so you know you can be informed on what to do when something goes wrong or how to adjust it or how to make it your own. Please subscribe. Like I said, we're always going to have new videos and it's a lot of fun. So once all your sugar is mostly incorporated, you would always want to go ahead and scrape down your bowl just to make sure you're getting all the bits in. There's nothing unmixed on the bottom. So that's what I'm just going to do right here. I'm just going to go ahead and give it a good mix. As you can see, we just had 4 eggs in here, and you can see how much volume we've gotten out of those 4 eggs because all we did was add sugar, and sugar melts in a liquid. So this is all volume coming from the whipping of the eggs. And so this will really help us to create that crust that we're looking for. So once the sugar has been incorporated, you want to go ahead and add in your vanilla and let that mix for just a little bit. Now we can go ahead and add in our bloomed chocolate, or cocoa powder, sorry, our bloomed cocoa powder. And you want to just do this slowly because it's a lot of oil. So you don't want to break the foam kind of that we've created with the egg. So you want it to emulsify. In order for it to emulsify properly, you want to make sure you're streaming in the oil slowly, because like I mentioned earlier, eggs do have a lot of water in them, and water and oil do not mix. But the yolk of the egg does have emulsifying properties. It has emulsifying proteins. So proteins that are both hydrophilic and hydrophobic. And so they are able to emulsify water and oil pretty much together. So, but in order to do that, they need to be done. You need to introduce the liquid slowly to each other. So we're introducing the fat very slowly into the mixture as it's whipping. And this will help it to suspend those particles in the water and not separate, by allowing the proteins to be able to take over and attach to whichever protein, whichever molecule it needs to keep it in solution. But that was a long, long sciencey way of saying stream in the bloomed cocoa powder slowly into your egg mixture until all of it's been incorporated and we have a nice chocolatey, eggy concoction. Okay, now we're gonna go ahead and add in our dry ingredients. So our cocoa powder, our flour, our cornstarch, and our sea salt that we've sifted together earlier. And I'm just going to, again, make sure I'm scraping the bottom, make sure there's nothing on the bottom of the bowl before we go ahead and fold in our flour mixture. So again, I'm going to fold this in. We don't want to work the batter too much. It's going to be a very, very thick batter because we do have a lot of cocoa powder in here, and cocoa powder does hold a lot of moisture. So it's going to be very thick. But because we do have some flour in here, we don't want to develop too much gluten. It's going to be hard to do so because there's very little flour in here, but you just don't want to overmix it. Just mix it until all of the powder, any dry ingredients have been incorporated and you don't see any dry bits left. And then you're ready to go ahead and move on to your next step. I will say this is a little bit of an arm workout because this is a very thick batter. So be prepared to really muscle this batter around to get everything incorporated. So once you have a nice thick batter, like you can see here, it's not even falling off the spatula when I pick the spatula up. Once you have a nice thick batter with no dry spots left, you can go ahead and put it straight into your baking dish, or you can add whatever mix-ins that you have. I decided I wanted to add some dark chocolate, chopped up dark chocolate to mine. So here I am adding it in just to add to the chocolatiness. I mean, because it's not chocolate enough. So I did add a little bit of dark chocolate to mine. And again, you just want to fold it in until it's incorporated. You don't have to do a whole lot of mixing here, and you don't have to add anything. It's definitely enough chocolate by itself without any mix-ins, but sometimes you want to add something else to the mix, and that's fine. You can go ahead and do that here. So I am using a 9 by 13 inch baking dish, and you can use a square 8 by 8 or 9 by 9 baking pan. It'll just take a little bit longer to bake because you will have thicker brownies because it's going to be a smaller area. But this 9 by 13 worked just fine for me, and they were still pretty good thickness for me. And what you want to do, you just want to scoop out all of your batter and into the baking dish, and then spread it evenly in the baking dish. Because this is, like I mentioned, a very thick batter, it's not really going to just flow to the corners of the baking dish like a cake batter or something would. So you do have to help it along a little bit, by just kind of smoothing it out and making sure it's even, because you don't want it baking unevenly, because then you'll have some sections that are like burnt and other sections that would still be undercooked. So you just want to make sure you spread it evenly, especially if you're using a bigger dish like I am. And just to mention, I am using parchment paper here, a parchment paper sling, so one piece across the middle and one piece along the edges, just so it's easy to lift out of the pan when it's done. But on top of that, you do want to actually also grease your pan. So grease underneath it and then grease on top of the parchment paper if you're going to use a parchment paper sling. If not, just make sure you grease the pan in general. Otherwise, these brownies will not come out of this pan after they're baked. So just please make sure everything is greased very well. So once everything's done, it's time to put it in the oven. And this is a 350-degree preheated oven, and I'm just gonna stick it on the top rack in the middle. And this took about, in my pan, because it's a thinner layer, it took about 20 minutes to bake. And you want it to be where when you stick a toothpick in the middle, it comes out with still a little bit of wetness and crumbs to it. You don't want it completely dry. And here it is, the final result. Some delicious, fudgy, chocolatey, crispy on top, but ooey gooey and chewy in the middle brownies. And as you can see, like I mentioned, we got that nice crisp top just from whipping those eggs, so that with the sugar, so that we could get that kind of meringue crunch on top. So you can see the beautiful crust that we got, and you can see how fudgy the brownies are. And this is due to the low flour content, as well as the cornstarch we added that holds on to some of that moisture. And the eggs also will help with that, retain some of that moisture and provide a little bit more structure because of the small amount of flour we have. Make sure to subscribe and leave a comment below if you love these brownies. And until next time, happy baking!